at evidence of the rise in fascism and authoritarianism, and some of the evidence to back that up, as well as analyze what dynamics are currently operating in the US and what elements of history in the United States might have given rise to those modern dynamics. Because once you have a good grasp of history and you can see precedent, then it becomes much easier to deal with. And we need things to be a bit easier to free up our emotional energy to help us be effective counters to some of the more malevolent forces working to serve their own interests at the direct expense of everybody else. And the negligently murderous pandemicidal response of the Trump administration highlights why it's really key that we continue to invest our energy in doing that, in standing up for democracy, because democracy, when it works, is a flexible system that allows you to have people of integrity who will respond in not just a well-intentioned but a well-informed way to crises as they arise. And you don't see the massive loss of life and institutional erosion that you saw and that everybody saw happen under Trump if you were paying attention. And of course, if you weren't paying attention, then you probably believe a whole bunch of weird things, possibly that vaccinations are ticking immunological time bombs or magnetize you, make keys stick to your face. There's all sorts of fun things that you might believe that we can go through just because it's an effective rhetorical technique to make people on the right face up to who exactly they're allied with and who are the central drivers of policies on the right and actions, including obstructive actions. So yes, there's some bought out politicians in the Republican Party and a couple of Democratic senators who seem to evince signs of being either purchasable or already purchased. And of course, I'm referencing Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who have both stated their opposition to the filibuster, even though the filibuster is allowing Republicans to act as a governing majority in the Senate, even though approximately 41 million more Americans voted for Democratic senators than Republican senators. So their attachment to an archaic filibuster that has been used to often stymie civil rights protections and voting rights of the American people, and more particularly Black American people, that loyalty to the filibuster has historically been at the expense of full functional democracy in the US. So we're all about turning that attention to Senator Manchin, and not just to complain about him, but to closely analyze what exactly he's playing at and how to best counter the worst parts of his actions, obstructive actions. So this is something that relates to the breaking news that the Department of Justice under Trump and under specifically the Trump-appointed Attorney General, William Barr, acted to seize details from Apple, which Apple handed over, phone records from both Representative Adam Schiff and Representative Eric Swallwell. So people on the right might go, yeah, well, we've been hearing for ages that they were, tapping, that Obama and Schiff and Swalwell were tapping Trump's microwave and all sorts of things. So that's just fair. I don't expect to necessarily break through to people whose identities are hardened around believing infamous liar Donald Trump, who did tweet out propaganda very regularly to accuse Democrats of things that he evidently was doing through his corrupt, wicked, compromised Attorney General. So here is a little clip of Kamala Harris, who was at that time senator. This is before she became Hooray, Vice President of the United States. Kamala Harris questioning William Barr prior to his appointment as Attorney General. She asks him if the president or anyone at the White House has ever suggested or asked him to open an investigation into anyone. Now, this clip, you might remember it. It's got 2.5 million views here on Twitter, but it was probably also shown on the news. Oh, I haven't even opened the comment section yet. Marsha's here. Hello, Marsha. Bob wants to know how my father is doing. My father's doing really well, which is why I'm happy. He's going to be released from hospital today. So it's great. It's all good news. Here we have Kamala questioning William Barr, who gives quite an extraordinary answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General Barr, has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone?
I wouldn't.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat that question?
I will repeat it. Has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone? Yes or no, please, sir?
The president or anybody else?
Seems you would remember something like that and be able to tell us.
Yeah, but I'm trying to grapple with the word suggest. I mean, there have been discussions of matters out there that they have not asked me to open an investigation, but
Perhaps they've suggested,
I don't know. I wouldn't say suggest.
hinted,
I don't know.
inferred. You don't know. Okay. In your March 20. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General Barr, has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone?
I wouldn't.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat that?
So that was William Barr. Could you repeat that? I'm just grappling with the word suggested. And Kamala Harris implies, hints. Have they ever asked you to open an investigation? Asked, hinted, suggested. Can't recall anybody ever doing that. So it sounds as if they did ask him, and he used his authority as Attorney General to compel a company, Apple, to disclose, to give up the private data, the private phone records of Representative Adam Schiff, of Representative Eric Swallwell. So like Watergate, but using a corrupt Attorney General to achieve those aims instead of having to break into a hotel. What's the excuse? The right will buy the excuse of, well, it's just tit for tat. It's just fair. What about Trump's tapped microwave? What about all the injustices of claiming that he had ties with Russia just because his first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, turned out to have lied about talking to the Russian Attorney General, just because his first appointed National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, turned out to have lied to FBI agents about his phone conversations with the Russian ambassador and notorious Russian spy, Sergei Kislyak. Just because Michael Cohen ended up confessing that, yes, negotiations over building a new Trump Tower in Moscow were going on for a long time during Trump's 2016 campaign for president, longer than was ever disclosed to the public. Trump was effectively in negotiations with Putin because you need Putin's permission to build a tower in Moscow. How can that happen from Apple's end? Well, usually they wouldn't agree to do it, but it was an attorney general, so they decided to make an exception. Things that we think are unbreakable laws are sometimes just norms, and those norms perhaps get away with not being violated for a long time, and then you find out there are certain conditions under which companies will violate those norms because they think, well, that's not going to scare our customers because this is a secret investigation conducted by an attorney general who's powerful because he's not independent from the president. He clearly is directly doing the bidding of the president. So we must bow to this this request, even though it's not appropriate and not within the norms of how an American democracy should function. So that's how it can happen. They let it because they pandered to Trump. And everybody laughs that Trump made a mistake and called Tim Cook, the head of Apple at the time, Tim Apple. But Apple and Facebook and ExxonMobil and Novartis and lots of other companies wanted to get in bed with Trump to a degree because he was powerful and he was consolidating executive power. So he was growing more powerful. He was defying Congress and circumventing norms, doing things that illustrated if you want to succeed in business in America, you better kiss the ring. Why aren't we boycotting Apple, Facebook, etc.? Well, the news about Apple has only broken within the last few hours. And my focus at the moment is just for people to know about it. I can sense that we've had a lot of fear that Trump would never meet with consequences, and this is rational fear because there was an insurrection. And we want to be reassured that there won't be further violence and further degradation of American democracy. But what's happening is that 500 people have been arrested for the insurrection. What's happening is that details are breaking that finally conspiracy charges are being brought against some of the Oath Keepers. So there are positive developments, and there are also people who will lean into stressing us out because we have an appetite for that, just because anything we suspect will lean into having our ideas confirmed, not because it's comfortable, but just because humans like to be right. So even when sometimes a belief is negative, it can operate as clickbait for us to say, oh no, everything's falling to bits, because we fear that. And that's therefore becomes something we think, and therefore we lean towards people sometimes who will confirm our thoughts, even when they are not entirely substantiated thoughts. So we're leaning towards being afraid of Merrick Garland, and that's okay because Merrick Garland deserves scrutiny. He's been at pains to try and demonstrate a point of difference from William Barr, that he is independent from Joe Biden, unlike William Barr as Attorney General, who worked together with Trump to defeat democracy as much as possible, to drive protesters out of Lafayette Park so that Trump could proudly walk through in an election pose of performative strength together with performative religiosity. Carrying a Bible, protesters violently cleared out, a blow against the enemies of Trump's America. People protesting against the disproportionately unjust treatment meted out to Black Americans. So there's been a report issued by a Trump-appointed Inspector General that cleared William Barr without interviewing him and without interviewing the police who were employed that day in Lafayette Square. So it's a rubbish piece of report, and it's sad to see reports that come out while Biden's in office, and we say, hey, haven't you had time yet to get rid of Trump appointees everywhere? And the answer is no. No, it takes time to find new appointees and to collect the resources necessary to fire all the people who are still trying to protect Trump's reputation and consequently protect the reputation of Republicans. Oh, Brett Walker's here. Hello, Brett. Nice to see you. I have a question for the HAPS team, which is there any HAPS technology that can be used to change a green screen background into something else? Because I used to have that with a different platform I used called StreamYard. And I'm here on HAPS, and HAPS has been lovely and welcoming. And it's so nice that the team pop around to drop into my broadcast. I love it. But yes, if there's any green screen technology, let me know, because not that this is boring, it's reliable to look at it from a different angle, but Yes. All right, I'm going to open up Twitter again just because Twitter's introduced me to so much breaking news today. We can look at the new conspiracy charges for people involved in the insurrection, because that's very important to recognize that progress is being made in building up from the foot soldiers, building up from the people who didn't have much of a plan, but who traveled to the US Capitol to overthrow the results of the election because they deemed them to be what Trump said they were, deemed them to be stolen results, to the people who more actively coordinated violent plans to overthrow the government, the people who took those additional steps to violently overthrow democracy. Okay, good. Well, Brett reassures me that they're thinking about it, but nothing currently, which is fine. I just like to make sure that I'm not behind in my embrace of technology and I'm not missing or overlooking some special button. So that's good to know. In the minute the Democratic House won a majority in 2018, that's apparently when Donald Trump opened a bogus investigation into Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation. And in February of 2018, they were getting metadata from Schiff. So it implies that there's a pattern of trying to besmirch Trump's enemies. So not really an investigation based on anything to investigate, but just systematically going through people who Trump wanted to frame as wrongdoers. And he had promised his crowds that they would work to lock her up. And he also perpetually besmirched Adam Schiff's reputation and saying he was a pencil neck. And yes, I don't watch those propaganda channels, so it's hard for me to relate to the depth of that indoctrination. But I did visit the US in 2018, and a taxi driver that I spoke to, or an Uber driver, whatever he was a Republican, and I spoke favorably about Robert Mueller being a Republican. And I was surprised by the depth of his vehemence that Robert Mueller wasn't a Republican, that he wasn't a Vietnam War hero, that he was a traitor and somebody out to get Trump. And I know people felt strongly about Adam Schiff and Swallwell as well. They just heard accusations, and those accusations were repeated to the lowest common denominator of low information voters. And I'd like to disparage what I think is a myth, the myth of, oh, well, they're uneducated. If only there was more education. This is not the product of low education. There are lots of educated people who've surprised their friends and family with their devotion to fabricated Trump narratives. It's not a product of lack of education. It's a product of fear-dominated thinking. It's a product of overexposure to very sophisticated psychological manipulation networks run by Rupert Murdoch and Fox and Charles Koch and Robert Mercer, people with a lot of money and people who get a lot of return on their investments in presenting certain ideas to the public, that you should be afraid of Robert Mueller, that you should be afraid of Adam Schiff, that they are threats. A lot of fabricated threat amplification. So a lot of Nazis were well educated as well. It's about pursuing power as an avenue to so-called safety and advantage. Yes, we're securing the nation by identifying our enemies, our communist enemies and our Jewish communist enemies. Jewish people overall are quite likely to get the idea that Trump has imposed a threat because it powerfully weaponized people's emotions. And even educated people have a reduced capacity to think rationally when their fear triggers are pushed over and over again. So people are blanketed with imagery of caravans. So we think, oh yes, congratulations to me, because I'm educated, but at the same time, if you had had an injury that had confined you to your house and the only thing that was on was Fox News, there but for the grace of God, go away. If you had enough of a narcissistic trigger to find Fox appealing, because Fox reassures everybody who's white that there's lots of enemies out there, that they're needed and valued to combat those enemies. And those enemies are people who try and tell America and American children that slavery happened and that subsequent other things that were bad happened as well. People who interfere with undiluted positivity about America. They fear that depressiveness that does impact some people when they go, oh, okay, so white people are responsible for a lot of crimes in the US and a lot of riots, a lot of murderous riots that destroyed the property and well-being and livelihoods and lives of Black people in America. It didn't end with slavery. It was a backlash to Reconstruction. It was a resurgent Confederacy that derived political advantage from challenging an election result until they achieved the concession of removing troops from southern states, where those troops had been there as a sandbag wall to protect African American lives, to protect freed slaves, free people from the emotional backlash of white people whose worldviews were challenged by the success, any success or any functionality of Black people, who they had a huge bank of negative rationalizations stored up in their brains that had provided a justification for slavery. So the challenge of Reconstruction was not just that Black people had nothing and were freed, but were freed without being given land or mules or 6 acres or any acres or anything, and had to fend their way in the world without income or accumulated assets. That was not the only difficulty. The difficulty was all of the hurt feelings of white people whose worldviews that had been formed in the crucible of decades and hundreds of years of inherited justifications for race hierarchy, that white people should be up the top making the money, and all of that accumulated wealth from profiteering from entrapped, enslaved human beings. That was fine. That was religiously justifiable. That was scientifically justifiable. That was ethically and morally justifiable. Yes, Bob's going to bed. Sorry it's so late, Bob. I've apologized before that my children's timetables for home-based learning is not conducive to earlier broadcasts at the moment, but we'll see how we go going forwards, and still counting down to Davina moving to the US in July. So let's go back to Twitter. Twitter's been my education after my formal education was finished. And reading the works of Black historians, just not even having to make the commitment to a book, but to encounter and consume details of American history that's uncomfortable to learn about. It's uncomfortable for white people, but we have to get comfortable with grappling with actual history so we can arrive at an informed understanding of what's happening and why there are some powerful people who oppose voting rights and who oppose legislation that strengthens voting rights. It's part of a naked pursuit of power for Republicans because of the role that Black Americans play at present to help elect Democratic politicians. They are the reliable voting spine block of voters. And Republicans want to make that more difficult by making it legal to mandate certain forms of ID to be presented, certain forms of ID that, as you've heard me say multiple times, are less likely to be in the possession of some Black Americans, particularly elderly Americans, Black Americans who were born in an era of segregated hospitals, whose mothers didn't have access to the birth certificates that are hospital issued. And that therefore becomes a poll tax of saying, pay money to have a birth certificate created for you. Just another element of deterrence, which Republicans are deploying in order to weaken American democracy and flourish in the absence of protected worker rights. Oh, I got a super hard award from Bernadette. Thanks, Bernadette, for that. And Marsha notes that her world has been shaken up since 2016. Me too, Marsha. I've learnt a lot. And if I feel discouraged, I try to remember that the people who agitated for civil rights for decades couldn't succumb to discouragement, couldn't succumb to those feelings of cognitive dissonance, that they would like to believe the world is good, but yet even good people were passive or active in allowing bad things to happen and discrimination to occur, and the collective power of voting be denied to so many. Even though during the Reconstruction years, Black Americans could vote and did vote and elected various Black officials who were then run out of office by the collective violent outrage of many white people who, for various psychological and financial reasons, found it intolerable for Black people to have power. Cosmic Rose says never quit, which is great. Yes, perseverance is important. Oh yes, this was the news that was so important for me to break, that now we know Apple handed over Representative Adam Schiff's data to the Trump-controlled Department of Justice. Schiff is now calling for an Inspector General inquiry into the Trump DOJ's efforts to seize metadata from him, Representative Swallwell, and their aides and family members, as well as other instances of weaponization of law enforcement by a corrupt president. So there you go. If you've been just aching to hear somebody say the words corrupt president, if you've been aching to hear important people reference Trump's corruption without just letting it slide, people who understand that for the health of a democracy, you can't just sweep everything under the bridge. You need elements of truth and reconciliation to occur to prevent further violence and further seditious efforts to overturn the government, and further slow-rolled insurrections where people start to control the vote in order to manage democracy into Republican political wins achieved through the mechanism of legalized cheating. Marsha's just still so surprised that Apple gave it up so easily. Well, they were the law. It was hard to say no because it feels like you're supporting the rule of law to obey the Attorney General.
Team and its forensic.
Yeah, he said he needed it. He would have told them it was a matter of national security. They gave it up very easily, but there wasn't any public scrutiny of this either to help motivate them to do the right thing. Companies will do the right thing if you're watching them closely, and you can mount a response to wrongdoing. So William Barr was able to operate in secret because he was the Attorney General and he was the law at the time. And when corrupt people in office and make themselves the law, then you have very corrupted outcomes, such as private companies handing over the private metadata of individuals, their aides, their family members, etc. It was pure corrupt persecution of the people Trump wanted to most rile his base up about. Okay, here's Representative Swallwell.
SWAT team and its forensics team on the floor after the attack. But before the attack, you told the Intel committee that you were looking for and through social media as a key part of investigations, and that you would get tips from social media companies. Prior to January 6th, did the FBI receive any tips from social media companies about threats to the Capitol?
Well, we've had so much information now, I'm reluctant to sort of answer any question about the word any, especially because we're now, 500 arrests into an investigation and after the fact. Certainly we were aware of online chatter about the potential for violence, but I'm not aware that we had any intelligence indicating that hundreds of individuals were going to storm the Capitol itself, to my knowledge.
Do you believe the Bureau has the ability to monitor publicly available?
So that's interesting. That was a video of Representative Swallwell asking the FBI director, Christopher Wray, who's a Trump appointee, who's still in power. This is why you can't get rid of Trump appointees straight away. Christopher Wray's been involved in a lot of ongoing projects. He's just recently been part of a collaboration between Australian federal police and the American FBI to trick criminals all over the world into using devices with an app that was actually created by Australian federal police tech officers and the FBI, an app that promised to keep your data private, and no federal agents would be able to crack the code. Really, it was created by federal agents, and all of their messages, secret messages, and their criminal conspiracies were being exposed in real time. So there's been a lot of arrests, and there'll be drug and gang related violence and various white collar crimes exposed. But I'm just saying that to highlight that Christopher Wray was involved with that. So you can't just instantly fire anybody associated with Trump, because there's sometimes some good things, like very important things. Oh, thanks, darling. Then you're going to head off. Whew. You didn't trust me to put the milk away?
Oh, thank you.
My husband was going to go out, but he stayed to get groceries because he knew that in the middle of a broadcast I might be less than sprightly to put away milk. All right, Barbara McQuaid. She's running for something now, I think. She's a University of Michigan legal professor and a law analyst for NBC News, former US attorney. Maybe she's not running for anything. Okay. But she's got 458,000 viewers, so her reach is fairly large. She's awarding Merrick Garland some grades, and she gives his independence an A+ grade and his legal judgment a C+. And that's because Merrick Garland has agreed to continue using the DOJ as a stand-in for Trump in a defamation lawsuit. So this is a defamation lawsuit. It's not making a finding of whether or not Trump raped E. Jean Carroll in a high-end change room. It's a question of whether or not presidents should be defended for making remarks to reporters that end up being questionable. So he's like, yes, it's just, I would do this for any president. And people are like, Trump is not just any president. He corruptly defamed a woman to say that she was just claiming she'd been raped by Trump in order to sell copies of a book, and that she's a liar. So the Department of Justice did use language to say that it was rude, crude, and disrespectful. But they say it's a question for the court to decide about the defamation, but they're still happy to represent Trump on his behalf now that he's out of office. And people are taking that case as a proxy for whether or not Trump's guilty of raping a woman. And so they're very unhappy that the Department of Justice, a taxpayer-funded institution, they think it's going to be defending Trump in a rape case, but it's a bit more complicated than that because it's a defamation case. And so a lot of legal experts have chimed in to say they think it's perfectly okay for the Department of Justice not to represent Trump, and that maybe Merrick Garland's being a bit too officious in trying to demonstrate even-handedness. But it's not going to throw anything in jeopardy. It's not going to give Trump immunity from justice. This is a defamation case that Trump will now have someone to defend him in, but that's not going to control the outcome of the court's findings. The judge will make the decision on whether or not Trump was within his job performance when he so heavily savaged E. Jean Carroll for daring to speak up about what happened to her, which I would say is rape, because it'll be confirmed when Trump has to finally hand over a DNA sample. That's not something the Department of Justice is going to mess with. That's Trump's DNA. If they manage to get a DNA sample from him, I believe a sample will show up on her dress. Seems likely. I leave it to the courts to find out, but Trump certainly does have a history of being accused by 21 different women of either sexually assaulting them or raping them. So that pattern, to me, does not speak to a pattern of persecution. It speaks to a pattern of women who have brought a whole weight of negative public attention on themselves in an effort to expose someone because they thought they were sheltered by the fact that Trump had just admitted or had been exposed as admitting on the Access Hollywood tapes to being someone who grabs women by the pussy because he felt that he could get away with it and that he was entitled to do so. So that's why Trump has so many accusers, because they thought, yep, it's worthwhile for me to speak up because people will believe me because Trump's voice is on a tape. Turns out that was not enough, hearing Trump's voice admitting to sexually assaulting women, because the bias of overly hyper loyal white people, hyper loyal to a symbolic centerpiece for focal point for white dominance politics. They were like, no, we're prepared to always give him the benefit of the doubt, and we're prepared to make really far-fetched arguments that Trump was just joking and that he jokingly said that he likes to grab women by the genitals. That's a fine joke to make, and we don't think it reflects poorly on his character at all. In fact, it convinces us even more that we want to vote for him. Marsha loves Barbara McQuaid. Oh, yes, Bernadette has lizard friends. Yes, I remember she wrote to me, how are your lizard friends doing, Bernadette? I just saw the word lizard friends and I suddenly remembered that I thought my children might enjoy broadcasting with me if we were all going to broadcast as lizard people, and that would be a fun sort of YouTube angle to take. If we were going to say, report on what the lizard people are up to right now. The lizard people are asking for a functional Department of Justice that is prepared to take on the legacy of Trump's perversion of justice and successful efforts to corrupt the Department of Justice. Someone I respect notes that critical race theory is a new talking point. It's the new welfare queen, an elevation of something relatively obscure to prominence in order to signal racial group solidarity without using explicitly racial language. So you can show that you don't like Black people, or you're scared of Black history becoming too predominant in schools. You're scared of your children learning the truth about slavery or the end of Reconstruction. You're scared that people will make your children feel guilty for being white. You can show your loyalty to groups that say, white history is all beautiful and pretty, and we believe you need to feel proud and that you need to be protected from that truth in order to feel proud. So we won't want anybody contaminating our children with the truth of American history. And so I will show that loyalty by saying I'm really anti-critical race theory. It's a new signal for racial group solidarity. I find that phrase very insightful. You don't have to use the words white or Black. You just have to say, I decry critical race theory. It's a stand-in for signaling who you sympathize with and what type of world you want. You want a world where they use textbooks written by daughters of the Confederacy that skip over slavery, that say indentured servants, or that skips over what happened when slavery was officially ended, that skip over what happened when Reconstruction was too emotionally costly for groups of hyped up white people who massacred Black people at various points all across America after federal troops were withdrawn. And even in in many different states. So that's Florida. That was brought up because Florida is the latest state to bar critical race theory. And there's footage from some parent meetings at schools, PTA meetings or school board meetings, and parents have booed and screamed and said that they want cameras on teachers to make sure the teachers aren't teaching their children critical race theory in class. Critical race theory just essentially being a more honest version of black and white history in the United States, black against white history, so that they not be able to contend with the truth and the persistence of dynamics of resentment, jealousy, and a commitment to keep Black people from amassing fortunes and successful businesses in order to continue to bolster the fabricated rationale that white people were inherently superior to Black people, and that therefore the status quo of slavery was justified by God and justified by the Constitution. Because the Constitution didn't explicitly enshrine slavery, but the Constitution did enshrine political pandering to slave owners through the mechanism of the Electoral College system that allowed rural, low population states, low white voter population states, even though they were high slave population, low white voting population states were able to exercise disproportionate influence over political outcomes because the result of a popular vote election could be overturned by an electoral college result that gave additional weighting to the voters from smaller states. Oh, Kim met Bernadette's lizard friend. Yes, the DOJ is concerning people, but it's just trying very hard to differentiate itself from Trump. So people are right to say, hey, do not make the mistake of trying too hard, trying so hard to show independence from the Biden administration that you start to make legally and morally questionable judgments. But they're not trying to do what Barr did, which is corrupt a department to serve Trump. They're not trying to serve Trump. They're trying to illustrate even-handedness. And I'm not saying I agree with their efforts, but it's still a different intention and a different motivation. So both bearded dragons have started eating on their own. That's nice. And also your crested geckos. Lovely. I'm going to touch on Jennifer Lawrence, who's a pretty actress. And when she put out this video, the comment section is full of men saying, oh, so thanks, pretty actress, for telling us what to think.
You find yourself on, you need to know that you're...
And of course, the reality is that non-pretty billionaires have been paying for the Heritage Foundation to write legislation and hand it over to Republican politicians in state legislatures around the United States. I think it's as high as 39 different states with legislation that will be enacted to reduce the access to the vote, to make mail-in voting more difficult because Trump pretended it was easily corruptible, to make voting souls to the polls not a thing because voting will only be legal after 1 p.m. on Sundays. So that crossover time between church and voting is extended. So you can't just go from church at 10 to the polls at 1 because you have to go somewhere else and do something else first, just making it untenable. This whole movement that Black people use to make voting fun, to help overcome voting reluctance because of that is associated with the negative circumstances of white people killing Black people who had the audacity to vote, of lynching them. Hello. Yes, did you want some more bread, or has Daddy's going to get some more food, hasn't he? He's still here? Well, he just unloaded some groceries as well. So you could check with Daddy what he unloaded and see if it's anything that you want. Go.
She got some butter, but it's not here yet because he ordered butter.
The butter didn't come? You ask him, maybe the butter came.
No, it didn't. I was in the living room.
You ask Baba, you check.
Whatever your personal politics are, whatever side of the aisle you find yourself on, you need to know that your vote matters. And the outcome of our elections are not maneuvered and manipulated. In Texas, Georgia, and Florida, and 44 other states, there's a radical wing of the Republican Party that is actively dismantling Americans' rights to vote because they don't have the numbers to win otherwise.
I know.
Without gerrymandering or shutting down hundreds of voting facilities within reach of minorities, and specifically targeting and carving out people of
Well,
color,
if you go start
they
us
can't
first,
win.
okay?
But this is cheating, and it is not democracy. There's a law in the Senate right now called the For the People Act, and it can reverse these anti-voting laws, and it can stop billionaires from being able to buy our elections. It even says that all voting machines need to be made here in the US, but it's going to take a lot of pressure from us to get it to pass. So please go to www.represent.us/Jen, and my friends at
Yeah,
Represent
thank
Us
you.
can help you call your senator right now.
It's absolutely.
Let the politicians.
Okay, well, I'll say goodbye to people. Thank you for listening. Cosmic Road said it perfectly. It hurts the buses that go straight from the church to the polls. That's it. I was trying to say it and I was getting very long-winded. But yes, it disrupts the buses that take people from the churches to the polls. You can't have that same group joint movement. You can't have that same camaraderie. You can't have that same feeling of safety in numbers from a community that has historically been targeted by violent white supremacists and sometimes not violent, but just discriminatory. I know, I'm saying goodbye. Take care, everybody. See you again maybe tomorrow. And remember to keep an eye open for the good news as well as the stressful news. Bye-bye. You going to come say goodbye too? You can wave.
Hey,
Bye.
do it. Do it. I said bye-bye.
Marsha. Oh, yeah. Bye, Marsha, Kim, Cosmic Rose, Bernadette, Molly. Bye, everybody.